Facebook, Instagram, and even WhatsApp use StyleX to style their application. Now, StyleX is a CSS in JS library, and guess what? Luckily for us, it's fully open source. That means we can just npm install StyleX and use it to style our application. But recently, a lot of creators are saying that StyleX might be a Tailwind killer. So in this specific video, let's compare Tailwind CSS with StyleX, a CSS framework with a CSS in JS library, and see what we like and dislike about them, and let's use real world concrete examples for them. So without further ado, let's get started. Before we check out the code and start coding and comparing the differences between the two, Tailwind CSS as well as StyleX, let's understand why StyleX was born and what was the reason for why Tailwind CSS was created. So, for example, inside, if you go to the documentation for StyleX, here they clearly say that for years we had to choose as developers between design system components that already come with baked in styles and are hard to customize, or headless components that are completely unstyled. Now, headless components are essentially bare bone components that don't necessarily have any state or logic, but you had to pick between the two as developers. With StyleX, it empowers developers to build these UI components where you do have some custom styling baked in, but you can also easily customize them. And I do agree with them, but they do have a few features that we will take a look at so you can understand how easy it is to customize them or override the existing styles. But on the other hand, Tailwind is a CSS framework. It's a utility first CSS framework. That means it gives you a bunch of utilities, which are basically a combination of a different CSS properties so that we can style better. So if we take a look at the documentation, with Tailwind, it does give us a bunch of different properties, such as it will have these specific breakpoints baked in. Or if you want to add specific themes, then you can add specific themes here. Or it already has all these default colors, a default color palette for your project alongside spacing and screen sizes and so on. So Tailwind does do a lot out of the box because it is a design system after all. It is supposed to make your life easier. So that is the major difference between StyleX as well as Tailwind, that because they're both trying to solve two completely different problems. If you're interested in customizing a lot, then maybe go with StyleX because that might be a better solution for your project. But if you are only interested in a design system that Tailwind gives you out of the box, then you can use Tailwind as well. But keep this in mind, with Tailwind, you can still customize it even though you might have a design system. You don't have to use a Tailwind design system. But there are pros and cons to each approach, and you can pick and choose which would be best for your project. Now, I have created two identical repos with text Next.js StyleX demo and with text Next.js Tailwind demo. And these two repos are set up so that I can teach you the differences between the two, and we can go over what we like and dislike about these two, about Tailwind CSS and StyleX. In the first repo, the specific project uses StyleX library alongside Next.js, and this specific repo uses Tailwind CSS alongside Next.js. The files are pretty much the same, except that the styling is different. So let's go over the StyleX one by one. Now, in this specific StyleX repo, page.tsx is in fact the default route. So whatever is getting displayed on the right hand side is defined inside page.tsx file. Now, page.tsx has an h1, which is what we see on the right hand side, and we will get to this specific function next. Then we also have a layout file that wraps around the entire application, and it also has some styling. And similarly, global.css applies this beautiful gradient in the background. So if we head over to page.tsx, StyleX uses a function called as StyleX.create. And StyleX is in fact getting imported as an alias for everything that StyleX does export. And we invoke .create function here. Now, if you remember, this specific create function is quite similar to React Native's stylesheet.create function as well. For example, React Native exports an API called as stylesheet, which you can use to style your mobile app. that also uses a dot create function here, except the difference is that now since you want to style h1, then you would use h1 and add all the associated styles next to that. Similarly, inside of style components, it's also pretty similar, where we extract all the styles out in its own component, for example. Except in this case, the ugly part is that then you get confused between a regular component and also a style component. So we won't necessarily get into that. I do like style components, but it's one thing that's confusing about it. So inside of StyleX, if you want to, let's say, style font size, then you would add 2 rem. But if I want to increase it, then I basically go ahead and add 3 rem, for example. Now, similarly, if we take a look at the Tailwind repo, this is also a Next.js repo with a page.tsx files that points to the index route. And in this case as well, we have a bunch of utilities as Tailwind does provide a design system out of the box. So Tailwind Text 3XL is a utility which is a combination of two styles. One is font size and the other one is line height. Similarly, we can override the line height as well here by adding leading 3, for example, or leading 4, and so on. Now, just like in StyleX, we have font family here. In Tailwind, we essentially also have a bunch of font families, but then you use the utility font sans. But you get the idea that Tailwind has equivalent utilities which might have a one-on-one relation to the CSS property, or it has a combination of CSS properties included in one utility. But you can see already that this is in line, and a lot of people definitely complain that this definitely looks quite ugly versus specific one is separate, so it makes it a lot more readable and your html is it looks pretty good. Now with StyleX, in order for us to apply all these specific styles, then you can just say stylex.props and s.h1 is what you would use to apply h1. Now, this can be whatever we want. For example, we can call this foo. Here it should be foo for the styles to get necessarily applied. But more so, the convention is to use the specific element name or whatever the element is semantically there. So now here is how you can override styles with StyleX. So for example, this specific library StyleX was created so that you can override styles easily and you don't have to stick with the default styles that the library gives us. So in that case, you can basically add another property to the props function here. Second property will override the first one. So for example, let's create a new class and call this h1 custom. And let's just give a crazy font size here. So for example, right now by default it's 2 rem, but let's make it 6 rem. Now let's pass in s dot h1 custom here. Now the minute we do that, the font size for h1 custom overrides the font size of s.h1, but everything else stays the same. So you can easily override the properties. But you can also add conditionals, and then this makes your life a lot simpler. So for example, let's say we say is tab selected, and let's say this is a Boolean property of true or false. And once that specific tab is selected, then you want the color to change alongside the font size increase. But if not, then you don't want to do that. So you could easily do that. For example, you could over here say if is tab is selected, then pass h1 custom as a styling, for example. And here this should be s.h1 custom. Now, since this tab is selected, again, this style has been overridden. But let's just make this false. Look at that. It went back to its original styling. So you could easily just override styles and merge different styles like they show in the documentation here using the stylex.props function, because the style that was applied last will always override the previous one. But on the other hand, if you were to do the same thing in Tailwind, so for example, now it says Tailwind text 3XL. Now let's override this with 4 text 4XL. Now you can see that it's giving you a warning saying that it's applying the same CSS properties and that's not necessarily allowed. And a common pattern that a lot of people use a package called as class names. And this specific package is a JavaScript utility for conditionally joining class names together. And and these specific class names, if you do want to combine, then you would import the class name library here and then combine the styles. So it's not as straightforward to do that in Tailwind. You have to use an external library. But you could also do something similar where you would convert this into a string interpolation. Then in that case, you can add the conditional properties as expected. For example, just like we have is tab selected, we could add the same functionality here and then say that, hey, if is tab selected, then pass in text for Excel. Now, since this is false, if we turn this to true, then let's make this font size 6XL so that it's more visible. Then in that case, you can see on the page refresh, you can then see the font size change. And you could do something similar when in terms of when you're overriding styles inside of Tailwind. With StyleX, it definitely feels a lot more natural for overriding and merging styles in general. Now, let's say you want to pass in different breakpoints. Now, the difference between StyleX and Tailwind is that with StyleX, you can pass in media queries and then pass in a default value and then pass in a max width value, which is very different to what Tailwind design system considers. Now, with Tailwind, we basically use the media query with min width. So, Tailwind does prioritize mobile first versus StyleX prioritizes desktop first because it goes for max width rather than min width. So, for example, if you want to add a media query with inside of StyleX, then you could just pass in the value and then whatever other value that you want to provide. Let's take a look at an example here. So here for font size, we have font size as 2rem. But let's say we want the font size to be different on different devices, for example. This will be an object then. And here we would pass in as default value. So by default, it is going to be 2rem and then whatever breakpoint we want. So we can say mobile breakpoint. This is going to be, let's say, a value of 6rem, for example. Now, media mobile is not defined, but looking at the StyleX documentation, we can just take this as a media breakpoint. So we could define media mobile as this, for example. So this means that up until 800 pixel of max width, this specific font size will be applied. And then by default, it's going to be 2rem. So you saw that from 0 to 800 pixel is going to be that specific font size. So if I copy this and move it into a new tab, then now in this specific breakpoint, it is suddenly a smaller font size. This is a desktop screen versus this is more so a mobile device. So that's why you see it differently. Similarly, if you were to reverse it, this is 6rem and this is 2rem, which makes more sense. Then this becomes a smaller font size. And then if we go to our desktop, then this becomes a bigger font size. That's what is intended. So this is how you can define breakpoints or media queries with StyleX. But similarly, if you want to do the same thing inside of Tailwind, I would say that this is a lot simpler in Tailwind rather than in StyleX. Instead of by default, we want it to be 3XL. So by default on mobile, we want it to be 3XL. But the minute it extends to a specific breakpoint, then we want this to be, let's say, 5XL, for example. Now, if we head over to the Tailwind documentation, these are the different breakpoint prefixes that we can pass in. And since Tailwind does go for min width, that means it needs to be minimum of 640 pixel, 0 to 640, and then it will be a small breakpoint, otherwise medium, and so on. So all we need to do in Tailwind is add a prefix, which is a lot simpler compared to adding an object and then defining all the media queries here in StyleX. Now, again, we'll do the same thing here. Copy this URL in desktop. Now, you will see that this specific font size is that font size, and then this is a lot bigger. Now, one of the biggest advantages of using Tailwind CSS as a framework is its design system. It gives you a design system out of the box with all these different colors, screens, spacing, media queries, that is breakpoints, and so on. But in reality, if you were to use Tailwind CSS in a production application, in a enterprise, or in a company that you work for, it's more likely that your team, your company will have its own design system with own default values and so on. So you might need just a library that will give you the customizations to be able to override values, but at the same time, you want to pass in a lot of custom properties in general. Now, another disadvantage with Tailwind is that a lot of people hate how ugly the styles look, as the styles get really long and are all inline styles with Tailwind CSS. But with StyleX, you don't need to do that anymore. You have all your styles in the same file, but at the same time, you can override any of the styles as well as you like, as you see fit with your design system. You need a way to override the theme of the application entirely so that we can pass in our line height, our spacing, and so on. Now, Tailwind CSS does provide a way for you to add in your own design system, override any of your values in general. But StyleX also has something similar. So let's take a look at the two. If you like this video, then please hit the like button so I can keep creating more videos like this for you. All right, back to the video. Now in StyleX, if you do want to create a theme, then there are two options. One, you can definitely create design tokens, which are tokens that have unique values for spacing, for colors, and so on. For example, using a StyleX.defineVars function. But you at the same time, you could create a theme as well, and creating the themes, you could use the create theme function and pass in any values you like. For example, you could create the tokens and then create the theme and then use the theme inside of your application. For example, this is a Dracula theme, and this specific Dracula theme is then getting applied in the properties. Rest of the styles are overriding after. So we could create a theme just like that in StyleX. So let's do that now. Themes file has two tokens. One is a color token and one is a spacing token. That means we are passing in custom colors and spacing. So again, let's just take the tokens color and spacing from here. So let's create another file called as tokens.stylexjs, pass in the tokens, and here we are defining our tokens. And next, let's define the colors as well by basically copying this entire thing and then pasting it here. Now we have two different types of tokens. We have all these color values, which are primary text, secondary text, and so on. But at the same time, we also have a different range of colors as well, for default black and then for dark theme values as well, so that we can say that in dark mode this is going to be the specific color, versus for secondary text the other color is going to replace it. So for example, if we now go to create themes, now we have created this specific theme altogether. And if we head over to themes.js file, then we already have created the tokens file, no longer using spacing here, but we are using the colors here and then accordingly overriding it for the theme. So for example, here for Dracula theme, in dark mode, we want the color to be light purple, the primary text color. So that's what we are doing here. So now that we have this, let's go to our layout and then replace it. Now, in stylex.props, let's pass in another value, which is stylex.dracula. Text.dracula. Now, stylex.dracula is not defined here, so let's just import it. Now, again, the way they import here is just importing the Dracula theme and then pasting it. We can just paste Dracula over here. Now, if you go to themes, we have primary text, secondary text, accent, and so on. So now, in order for us to use any of these themes, we could just go to page file, for example, And then inside of color, let's just say colors dot primary color. Now, over here, we can just import the colors and tokens. And this is going to be inside of tokens dot style x. So we need to call this file tokens dot stylex.js. Similarly, we need to import it here as well with just tokens.stylex. Now, if you refresh the page, we have colors and we have spacing. So now if we console log it, you can see that all the colors are actually available to us with as CSS variables. And we can then directly pass it in. Similarly, we can pass in the spacing as well. But inside of themes, we have primary text. So let's use that here in H1. So in H1, let's just say colors.primary color. And primary color by default is purple. Let's just say colors.primary text. And by default, it's purple. So now let's just open this up in a new tab altogether. This way we can test it out for dark mode. So now I'm going to go ahead and change my application to dark mode. And the minute we do that, then you can see that the text has changed to black from purple. But let's say I change my application to light mode, then the text has changed to back to purple from black. So this is the beauty of setting up themes. Now, if we were to do the same thing with Tailwind, we want to basically create a global theme as well with Tailwind. Then what we could do is we could configure the default theme for our project by creating by extending the existing properties with Tailwind CSS. So Tailwind CSS has a file called as tailwind.config.js file, which is a global configuration file for Tailwind. And there we can extend the themes, the colors, breakpoints, font families, and so on. So how about we just copy this entire thing and then go to our Tailwind project, locate the file, and then inside of theme, let's just paste it. Now themes already exist, so we don't need additional theme. But now you can see that we have screens as well as we have colors. So now if we head over to our page file, for example, here we can easily apply the colors, for example, this specific color. So we can say text purple, and we would be able to see the color text purple apply here. So this is how you could basically also create a global theme inside of Tailwind and then accordingly pass it in. Now Tailwind also has dark mode as well, which you can enable to basically add Tailwind dark mode colors as well, which is again a utility that we have inside of Tailwind. That's how you can compare Tailwind with StyleX. But you could already see the advantages of StyleX versus Tailwind, where both of them shine in different places. So, depending on your application, you need to assess what is the right solution for your application. Now, another really cool advantage of using StyleX is that it comes with full support for static types. This means that you can say that you can only accept a specific type of styles, and you cannot just enter whatever styles you like. This way, you can add constraints for your design system and also help avoid any mistakes that developers can make in general. So, for example, we could just pass in a type called as StyleX styles, for example, in this specific component, and then that can accept a list of styles. So heading over to our example here, I have created a component called as a card component. Now, this specific card component has some styles for card, has some margin, padding, border, background color, and so on. Now, in props, it also has a specific style with a type StyleX style. So, for example, here it has StyleX styles, which comes from StyleX.js, StyleX types. So now here we are restricting style to be margin top of only 0, 4, 8, and 16. That means margin top cannot take values and other than these specific values. And this is what I mean that we can restrict the values that it can provide. This way we can say that these are the only allowed values so our design doesn't end up looking really wonky. So if we were to go to page, here we are using this specific card. So we can add a property called as style. And now let's take a look at an example. Let's say we were to declare mtop as a specific property on style. And this is where we create our style. So let's just create a new property called as mtop. And here let's just give margin top. Now, if we create a value of 0, we don't get an error at all because this is allowed. Similarly, we do the value of 4. Again, this is fine. Like I said, 0, 4, 8, and 16 is okay. But now let's give it a value of 20. The minute we do that, it does get applied, but it also gives us an error saying that it's not assignable to type StyleX styles. This means that this is going to tell the developer, it's going to throw a warning to the developer saying that this specific style is not allowed. This specific value is not allowed and is going to restrict the developer. So this specific static type is huge with StyleX because now we can constrain the accepted styles. And better yet, we can also say only these are the StyleX properties, these are the properties, CSS properties that can be applied. So, for example, if you want to say that, hey, I only want to allow a specific property and disallow all these other properties, then we can do that with StyleX by saying that I don't want any of these specific properties, and we are creating more like a block list instead of an allow list of properties for a specific component. Now, on the other hand, if you were to do the same thing with Tailwind, then we can reuse styles and create custom styles with Tailwind as well. Now, we have seen already how we could customize the theme. Now, we could create a custom style in Tailwind as well by defining a class name called as card. Now, this specific card class name is special because if you go to global.css, then in this specific file, there's another layer called as components where we can create custom components created with Tailwind classes. So here I'm creating a class named card and applying all these properties. Now card has become a Tailwind component, so we can use card inside of our div and then reuse card component wherever possible. Alternatively, we could do the same by creating a new file called as card and applying the class names that we have inside of here. So this is how you could also create components with Tailwind as well. But obviously, Tailwind does not come up with any sort of static typing, just like StyleX does. So this is a huge game changer with specific StyleX library, and I can see how companies will start to adopt them more and more. And I can see why other creators might be calling it a Tailwind killer, maybe. But again, depending on your use case and your application, you might want to stick to Tailwind CSS or you might want to stick with StyleX. Overall, I'm going to say that I'm definitely a fan of StyleX, especially the part where you can override styles and create global themes as well. At the same time, Facebook has created a lot of really cool, interesting libraries for us. So I'm really excited to see the future of StyleX as well. But at the same time, Tailwind CSS is always going to have a special place in my heart because I've been using Tailwind CSS for all my projects and it has been really quick to get on it and create really good designs thanks to its design system. So there's definitely pros and cons in both. So make the right choice for your project. Thank you so much for watching this specific video. Please comment below and let me know what is something about StyleX that you really love and hate. I would love to know from you. I would love to hear from you. And if you like this video, please hit the like button so I can keep creating these videos for you. Alright, that's all for this video. Bye for now.